I'm JB. This is the Back It Up Binge podcast, and I'm talking today with former Green Bay Packer, Baltimore Colt, coach, author, former ESPN commentator, and motivational speaker, Bill Curry. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Appreciate you joining. I thought we'd start with a question that's non-playing career related. I was doing some prep for our talk today, and I noticed that there was a couple of stories you've talked about in the different videos I've seen where you had interactions with Vince Lombardi, Willie Davis, Coach Shula, that you were able to step back from those interactions, sum it up, and maybe learn from it. And it's something that I do myself. And I'm wondering if that's your approach to life and if that approach has helped with your success. And do you try to impart that on people you run into, people you coach, mentor, people like that?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and one that very few people think about. I'm glad you did. In each of those cases, I wish with all my heart that I had practiced what I actually manifested in those cases all my life. I did not. Okay. I was angry, bitter competitor, thinking that that was justifiable. I grew up in the racist South with Jim Crow. I did not step into a huddle with an African-American person until I reported to the Green Bay Packers at age 22.
Okay.
And I was tainted by those things. And I take full responsibility. But I wish I had been more thoughtful sooner. I wish I had prayed more sooner. I wish I had been more cognizant of other people's, not just their feelings, but other people's basis and other people's motives for doing what they did. Later in life, all those things came, and that's why you noticed them. But it was much later than I would have liked.
Yeah, I think it's an important quality that I learned over the years, and I have a good support system where I have a couple of buddies, I have my wife, I have colleagues that I always step back and say, what am I missing here? What could I learn from this? And it's helped me with my success, and that's why I wanted to ask you about it coming out of the gate. There was one other thing I wanted to ask you about that I saw in some of the videos, some of the interviews you've done in the past. You played football, but it didn't seem like you were really that interested. You got pulled into it. You didn't even know that you got drafted. I think it was your brother who called you to tell you that. How do you reconcile your life, your career success with football being so intertwined in that, but yet you started out like, yeah, I don't really want to play?
Well, where I went to high school in College Park, Georgia, it was grades 8 through 12. And I had two goals in life. Number one was to marry Carolyn Newton, whom I had joined in the 4th grade in grammar school. And number two was to pitch for the New York Yankees. I didn't think about anything else. I wasn't capable of thinking about anything else. So I didn't. At College Park High School, however, if you didn't go out on that football field, you were not going to get a date with Carolyn Newton or anybody else. It didn't work for a long, long time. But finally, when we were seniors in high school, we started going out, and we've been married 62 years. So that one worked. The baseball, only one thing kept me out of the majors in baseball: talent. So once I realized I wasn't going to be pitching for the Yankees, I decided, well, maybe I better shift gears. And that's when I went full hog into football.
Did you play baseball in high school?
Yes. I pitched in the state finals, AA baseball, my junior year at College Park High School. We got beat by Rossville, Georgia, and I figured if I couldn't throw strikes against Rossville, I would not be doing very well against the Dodgers. So I started majoring in football more.
But see, you step back and you analyze. That's great. So let's move on to your playing career now. In 1964, you got drafted by the Raiders and you get drafted by the Packers. How'd you wind up going to the Packers? What was the thought process behind that?
Well, it was simple, but it wasn't easy. I stood on the sideline at the Blue Bonnet Bowl. It was actually my academic junior year, and I had been redshirted, so it was my football sophomore year. And my bride was sitting in the stands. Carolyn and I had gotten married at the age of 20, and she was very mature. I was not. We'll leave that right there. That's all I'm going to say about that. But my jersey was cleaned at the end of the game, and I was so embarrassed. So I went to the coaches after we got back home, and I said to one of the assistant coaches, "What have I got to do to get on the field?" And he said, "Bill, you're not going to get on the field. You're just not good enough. You don't move your feet well enough, and do your homework, graduate from this great school at Georgia Tech, and get your degree, help us recruit, but you won't be playing." And I was just crushed. Here I was, and it's going to be so embarrassing in front of my wife. And that's what I really thought about the most. And it wasn't 2 or 3 days till another one of the assistants, his name was John Robert Bell. He came to my locker. And I'll never forget that big old paw of his clamped on my shoulder. He grabs my shoulder and kind of gently turns me. And he was one of those guys that could combine a gentle nature while being one of the toughest ass coaches in the world. He could do that. There are very few people who can do that. But he said, "Bill, I know you can play. Why don't you and I go down to the practice field a little early and let's work on your footwork." I played 12 more years. I got to play all over the place with the greatest players of all time up until that time. And arguably still the greatest players of all time, I would argue. But and had it not been for John Robert Bell, that simply would not have happened. So that was an intervention by a noble, wonderful man who saw something in me that I couldn't see. And then I proceeded to have that experience over and over and over. Yes, with Don Shula. Yes, with Vince Lombardi. Yes, with Red Miller. Yes, with Ray Waiteka. With so many other, and I'm leaving out so many great coaches, names that folks would recognize, that I just simply got thrown with. And position players who came up behind me to take the snap by the name of Bart Starr and Johnny Unitas, and many other, Joe Namath, Roger Staubach, John Hewer, Darryl LaMonica, James Harris. I mean, it's hard to believe that I had the privilege of being in the presence of that quantity of greatness. And I'm still leaving a bunch of great guys out that were strong influences. So I just got thrown into very positive influences and a few negative influences. And in time, they had a lot to do. And I think it's a God thing too, that your attitude changes as you mature in life.
Well, it's interesting you talk about your footwork, because when I was looking at some of your videos from games, the one thing that struck me as a center, you were always moving. You were always moving. Where I watched a lot of other centers where they drop back, they plant, they look, your feet were always going. It was really interesting to watch. In 65, you go to the Packers. What was it like walking in, like your first couple of days? This is the Green Bay Packers. This is Vince Lombardi's team. Like, were you overwhelmed? Did you have a fear of not making the team?
Overwhelmed, fear, those are not the words. More like terrified. I mean, mortal fear.
Right.
Because I'm walking into this place, and first of all, like you said, it was actually my brother-in-law, Carolyn's little boy, who called me. And in those days, the draft was in December, and they had 20 rounds.
Right.
And it was my athletic junior year, my academic senior year. So Ronnie, Carolyn's little brother, called me early on a Sunday morning and said, "Hello, Green Bay Packer." And I hung up on him. I mean, certainly this is a joke. I had not heard from any NFL team. So he called me back and he said, you better get a newspaper. The Packers have drafted you in the 20th round. Vince Lombardi had turned to his personnel guy, Pat Pepler, who loved to tell this story publicly. And he said, Pepler, it's 2 a.m. I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed. We've drafted 19 players. Do something humorous with the 20th selection. And he walked out of the room. That's according to Pepler. And so that's what had happened, apparently. And also the Oakland Raiders in the 23rd round,
Right.
which was the first round for the AFL. I'm making a short story long here, but there's no other way to tell it. In my last game as a college player, the next season, as I came off the field, Red Cochran was standing on the field in Athens, Georgia, University of Georgia football stadium. And he says to me, how about you and Carolyn flying to Dallas with me to watch the Packers play the Cowboys tomorrow afternoon? It was like something out of fairy tales. Said, are you kidding? He said, well, I'm not kidding. It was Red Cochran, who was an assistant coach with the Packers. He took us to Atlanta. We had dinner. We got up the next morning. We flew to Dallas. And to make a long story short this time, they took me down and stood me next to Vince Lombardi in the fourth quarter, which was a blowout win by the Packers. And you asked me why I signed with the Packers instead of the Raiders. We're walking off the field, and Coach Lombardi turns to me and says, Bill, walk off with me. So we're walking across the Cotton Bowl, and he turns to me and says, Bill, would you like to play for the Green Bay Packers? Yes, sir. Well, yeah, that's how long the negotiations lasted.
That was an easy decision for you there. So one of the things I noticed, which I was surprised about looking at your playing career, you don't get protected in 67. A couple iterations, you wind up on the Colts. You're playing for Shula. But your first season there, you wind up becoming a linebacker. How did that move to linebacker occur from center? How was it communicated to you? And because you went back to being a center, did you not like being a linebacker?
Love being a linebacker. It was a lot like pitching for the Yankees. I just wasn't good enough. I was just good enough to get us beat. I had played line in college in those days. The way the substitution rules were, everybody had to play both sides of the ball. So
Okay.
I was a linebacker all the way through high school, all the way through college. And I wanted more than anything in the world to get to play linebacker in the National Football League. I loved playing defense. I just was one step away. And by golly, Shula let me play defense that entire 1967 season. And I could see that I just wasn't quite. By the way, my assistant coach there was a guy named Chuck Noll. So if you can't play linebacker with Chuck Noll coaching you and Don Shula, you better move back to center. And that's exactly what I did.
You also had a really interesting name. I'm a Dolphins fan, and I know the name because I followed him since, the 72 season. John Sandusky was a coach for you as well. And that was a big name for me, growing up watching the Dolphins. Met him a couple of times, really nice guy. But let's move into the Super Bowls. You played in 3 of them. Super Bowl I, you win with the Packers. Super Bowl III, which is the famous Super Bowl with Namath with the guarantee. You're on the Colts. What was it like going into that game? Were you and the Colts, the whole team, very confident? What did Shula say to you before the game, and then unfortunately after the game, with the notoriety of that game and the guarantee? What was his message in the locker room?
I don't have the vaguest notion what the message was before or after. We were 15-1. We had lost one game, and that was to Cleveland. We had just gone to Cleveland in our most recent game and beat them 34-0 in their stadium. And here we come right down to Miami. And Joe Willie Namath, who was a very controversial figure, he and I had played together in the Senior Bowl. So I had been his center, and he had been my quarterback. Well, after about 10 minutes of center quarterback exchange drill, which is what centers and quarterbacks do every day of their lives.
Right.
Joe and I were buddies, and we've been buddies ever since. So I couldn't even be hateful toward Namath just because he had a good game against us. a lot of their team had good games, and we turned the ball over several times, and that's how you get beat. And I mean, it's a nightmare to this day. And what we learn, what do you learn? If you're gonna play in the big game in America, then you better win it, because otherwise, the only thing anybody's going to remember is you're a loser, and that's how we remember. And our final record was 15-2.
Yeah, you talked about the turnovers. You had 5 turnovers, 4 interceptions, and 1 fumble in that game. But then you come back in Super Bowl 5, and that's where Jim O'Brien kicks the field goal, 5 seconds left against the Cowboys. And this is a Super Bowl that's never talked about. Do you think is there a reason why no one ever says, hey, what about, I know there were a lot of turnovers in that game.
Oh,
why is it never talked about?
Don't talk about it, because the O-line got together. We're going to redeem ourselves. This is Super Bowl 5. It took us 2 years to get back. We had all these errors in Super Bowl 3. By golly, we're going to play a airtight game, and we're going to win this thing going away. And we turned it over 7 times.
That's right.
Only a great defense bailed us out. And Jimmy O'Brien, who, by the way, walked up to Ernie Accorsi, our general manager, and Jim doesn't like for me to tell this story, but it's true. He said, Ernie, I hope they don't need me tomorrow. And Ernie said, what do you mean? He said, I can't kick off this artificial turf. I'm so glad none of us heard that, because he just drilled it right down the pipe. It was, yes, the game isn't mentioned, and there's a reason.
So you mentioned your turnovers. Dallas had, I think, 4 turnovers and 10 penalties. So it's sort of evened out, right? But the thing that I found interesting when I went back and looked at that box score is the Colts, Shula had moved over to the Dolphins, and then you had a new coach there, McCafferty. I think it's Don McCafferty. How was he like as a coach?
Well, he wasn't really a new coach. He had been there for
Right.
some time with Shula. And he took over when Don left. And I thought he was terrific. Not everybody on the team thought that, but I thought he was a great football coach. Offensive mind. We were not a very good team offensively that year. We were really good that Super Bowl 3 year, but defensively we were just lights out with Mike Curtis and Ray May and Ted Hendricks and those 3 linebackers and a great secondary and a bunch of feisty front guys. Really, we won on defense, and we won by really forceful leadership from people like Mike Curtis, because we had some very embarrassing losses during the year. Somehow we would fight back every time. And even though it isn't talked about, we'd rather have the W than not.
Fair point. So you mentioned about the who's who of the NFL that you played with. We're going to start diving into that. Let's start with your coaches, 2 of the best coaches ever, Lombardi and Shula. Can you talk a little bit about the relationships you had with them? What were they like to play for, and maybe share a couple stories about them?
Well, Coach Lombardi put me on the expansion list, and I was called by the New Orleans Saints, and I blamed him, which is the worst possible response to a situation like that, because there's nobody's fault but mine, and that I had been placed on the list. And so I just held this great bitterness toward Coach Lombardi, and I did the cowardly thing. Rather than to ask for an appointment and go look him in the eye and tell him what my difficulties were, I shut my mouth off, because when we got to Super Bowl 3, I was the only player there that had played for Lombardi and Shula. So they started asking me about the contrast. Well, Coach Shula had given me my opportunity, first as a linebacker and then as a center, and it worked out at center, probably because I had so many reps. But I almost blew that one because he called me, and I thought, this is probably one of my buddies messing with me because his voice says, "This is Don Shula." Sure. But then I decided to play it straight and not be a wise guy. So I said, "Okay, coach." He said, "Look, Bill, the reason I'm calling you is I'm thinking about a trade." Well, what he really wanted was that number one draft choice from the Saints so that he could draft Bubba Smith. And what he had that the Saints wanted was a great backup quarterback named Gary Quazzo, who was sitting on the bench behind Unitas. And so those were the main characters in the deal, and I was just a throw-in. But Shula wanted to know, "Bill, I know you've been a starter. I started my second year with the Packers because Ken Bowman got hurt." He said, "But I wonder if I trade for you, would you be happy playing just special teams?" Coach Dodd at Georgia Tech had trained us. All of us could play every special team because we did every day, covering kickoffs, snapping for punts, doing all those kinds of things. And so my answer was this to Don Shula: "Coach, if you trade for me, I will walk to Baltimore to play for you." So we lined up to play our first league game. Our little baby girl had just been born 5 weeks before. Carolyn was going to fly in with her. And I clip a guy. By the way, I'm special teams captain. Wow, Don Shula allowed me to be special teams captain. Imagine we walk out for the coin toss and the official says, "This is Captain Unitas and Captain Curry." The guy says, "Who?" "John or whoever." No, it was the Falcons. It was the Falcons. Anyhow, we're playing the Falcons, and I clip the guy right in front of the bench on an 80-yard punt return. Shula runs on the field and grabs me and screams some things that would have made Lombardi proud. And so I screamed some things right back in his face with similar language. Not a smart response. So John Sandusky, Tuesday morning, we're watching the film. He said, "Curry, is that a clip?" I said, he said, "Well, let me make a suggestion, young man. The next time you decide to dog cuss the head coach on national television, you make damn sure it's not a clip. Do you understand?" And I thought, "Oh gosh, I'm gonna get fired after one game with the Baltimore Colts." So I went and found Shula. And he took me in the equipment room, and I said, "Coach, I was completely out of line. I'm so sorry. I will never do that again." You know what he said? He smiled. He said, "I kind of like that. Just don't clip the guy." "Oh, you think we played hard for him?" "Yes, we did."
He sort of let you off easy there. I've heard stories about him. He normally doesn't react that way, does he?
I had some other times when he didn't.
So maybe we could tie up a loose end from a question that I asked earlier, and it's a great story about Lombardi. You did get mad at Lombardi. You tell the story where the press printed what you said, basically, and you were confronted by a former teammate, but you came full circle with Vince Lombardi. Maybe you could tell a little bit about that ending to that story, because it's a phenomenal story.
It required two wonderful teammates to make that happen. As I said earlier, at Super Bowl III, I was asked about Lombardi and Shula, and I shot my mouth off and I said some things about Coach Lombardi being abusive, and said some things that were borderline not even true. And the next time I saw Paul Hornung, who had been a good friend of mine, he wanted to fight. And so that sort of shook me up. And then he said something that I'll never forget. He said, "You made Coach Lombardi's mom cry." Oh my God. I never thought about Coach Lombardi's mom.
Yeah.
I did think about it. If you're a real man, the way my dad taught me, you go look him in the eye. You don't say it in the New York Times.
Right.
But didn't know what to do. It wasn't 2 weeks later, I was in Washington for the president's prayer breakfast. I'm walking up a narrow staircase, And guess who's coming down the other way? Oh, Judy. Lombardi sticks his hand out and he says, Bill, you and I need to talk. I said, yes, sir, we do. The next thing I knew, he was dying in the hospital, Georgetown. And I needed another great teammate to come to my rescue to show me his case. Bob Long is the person, show me what a good Catholic would do. Bob was Catholic. Actually, Paul was too. I am not. And Bob called me. He said, Coach is in the hospital. He's got colon cancer, and you and I are going to go see him. I said, oh, no, we're not. I wouldn't be allowed in the room. And he said, you might be surprised. The person I was really scared to see was Marie, because she had been so great to Carolyn and me. But Bob shamed me into it. We went and lit a candle for Coach, and he explained what that meant. And then we got off the elevator, and Marie was standing there with Sonny Jurgensen. And they turned, and I thought, Marie's going to slap me. And I don't blame her. She embraced me, hugged me, and said, let's go see. She called him Vin. Let's go see Vin. So his right arm was all full of IVs. So I took his left hand, choked out something like, Coach, I was stupid and I was wrong and said some things I shouldn't have said. And I came here today to tell you that you've been a lot to my life. He squeezed my hand. Those eyes had never changed. Body was emaciated, but the eyes were intact. He fixed me with those eyes and he said, Bill, you can mean a lot to my life if you'll pray for me. Promised I would. I had to leave. It was a great, great lesson in humility. So what had the great man done? He had forgiven me when I least deserved it. And that is the basis of the Christian gospel.
I have to share something with you about that story. I was on your website. Great website. It's Bill Curry. Is it BillCurry.net, BillCurry.com?
It ought to be called PeteWelburn.net. But
Pete's a great man.
BillCurry.net. But Pete's totally responsible, utterly. And I'm eternally grateful to him for everything you saw there.
So they have a lot of your clips of your speeches, and this is the one where I learned about this story, and I called my wife in. I said, you got to listen to this story. And I got to tell you, it was a tough one to get through. It really was. And I'm so glad you shared that. Just a phenomenal story. And that's where I led the conversation off with, because of that, where you're able to step back, because you probably took so many lessons from that. And it's just an incredible story. And what he gave to you was even more incredible. Really was. So appreciate you sharing that with everybody. You mentioned a bunch of quarterbacks. Let's focus on two out of the gate, and that's Bart Starr and Johnny Unitas. I'm sure you get asked a lot about these two quarterbacks. What was it like playing with them, being their center, having them in the huddle? What were they like? I heard a great Bart Starr story that he told, and it truly was a leadership story where he was in practice. Lombardi was all over him. He was yelling at him. And he went up to Lombardi's office and he said, look, you can yell at me all you want if I make a mistake, but please don't do it in front of the other players, because you're really chipping away basically at my leadership. And I always remembered that story in managing people. And he always seemed like a very cerebral quarterback, Bart Starr, and a name that you don't hear about anymore, in my opinion. I hear about all the current quarterbacks, maybe back with Marino, Montana, but you don't hear them go back to somebody like Bart Starr. And he was just a great quarterback. And then you're with Johnny Unitas. Maybe you could talk a little bit about both of them.
There's a difference when somebody embraces you with all his heart, with all her heart. And when somebody is good to you and your teammates together. Bart embraced me from the moment he saw me. I don't know why. I'm sure he didn't know why. I'm sure there were times when he wondered why in the world he did that. But he did. And from the day we met until the day we had his funeral, he was one of the best friends I ever had in my life, in the top 2 or 3. For reasons that I still don't understand, and I certainly don't deserve. But it started when I arrived at the Packer training camp. Oh, by the way, how about this? 5 world championships in 7 years. That will never be done again. Yeah. Never.
Exactly.
So you can talk all you want to. Yes, the guys are great. Brady's great, and I love all those guys that excelled in this much different kind of game that we play now. But there's only one of those that pulled that off. And yes, he was surrounded by a controversial team, controversial quietly. And I say that because a lot of the teams, I shouldn't say a lot, some of the teams in the NFL had no African-American players and bragged about it. Lombardi would not tolerate racism. If you said one racist sentence in Lombardi's locker room, your locker was empty the next day. It was unbelievable. I mean, you could look and see. So there was that dynamic that it was not a simple formula to put that package together and to make that thing tick. And when Lombardi when he would jump on Bart in front of the team, by golly, Bart would stand up and take him on in front of the team. That was before he went to the office to say, don't do that. And I'm sure he was polite when he went to the office, but both of them could be rough. I experienced Bart's anger several times, but he adopted me when I was walking to dinner at my first Packer. The very first night I joined the Packers from the college All-Star game. I didn't know there was somebody walking beside me until I turned and I just sensed him. I said, oh, Mr. Starr. He said, don't give me that Mr. Starr, it's Bart. And it stayed that way until the end of his life. And I miss him every day. So that was unique. And I can tell you 100 stories about Bart Starr. Equally with Unitas, people say, well, what's your greatest thrill in football? Here's my greatest thrill in football. I mean, for thrill, just pure tears, emotion. If we won the toss at Baltimore Memorial Stadium, out there on our beautiful field, which we shared with the Orioles. We shared a locker room with the Orioles. We called it Astro Dirt. That's what it was. But if we won the toss, we always took the ball, and the first player introduced was the center. So I would be introduced, and I'd run out to the 50-yard line and peel over to the bench and set the huddle. And then 9 more guys would be. And at that time, Baltimore, even though it only seated 63,000, it was called the world's largest outdoor insane asylum. That's what it was called, and that's what it was. It was a huge advantage for us. And so I would be introduced, and they were polite. My wife would cheer, and 2 or 3 other people. And it was nice. The Dundalk dock workers were incredible, great fans. And then Bob Vogel and Tom Maddy and Lenny Moore and Jim Parker and all these future Hall of Famers on our team. And the roar would be a little louder. And then the PA system would say, and from Louisville, number 19. And that would be the last thing you would hear. People actually, folks measured the decibel level, but I know a couple of years, could have been an exaggeration, but it was the loudest sound heard in the United States without nature being involved
Wow.
for the entire year. And when he waddled out to the middle of the field with those old bow legs of his, and he comes over and sticks his head, that nervous blink he had, that was, everybody there was already crying, and the game was over. Nobody had a chance against us. It was incredible. And I've never felt anything like that anywhere else.
You told a great story about him pregame, pregame speeches where the captains go, and then maybe you can tell that story because it's so, my impression of Johnny Unitas is that story, exactly that story.
Well, you're exactly right. That's exactly how he was. And he might be your friend, but he's not going to be buddy-buddy. And he wasn't going to make long speeches. The first day I got to the Baltimore Colts, he's walking down to the practice field, and it's about 105 degrees in Westminster, Maryland. I was so disappointed because I thought it was going to be cool in Maryland. I'm from Georgia. It's going to be cool in Maryland. Wrong. It was so hot. He had on a rubber jacket. He was humming a happy tune, and I'm walking behind him. So I said, "Hey, John, excuse me, but you seem awful happy to be going to football practice, and we're going down in this hole at Western Maryland College, and the game field was submerged, and it was just even more hot and intense, and nobody was looking forward to going down there and practicing football." And he turned to me and said, "Well, Billy, you know you're a long time dead." I said, "What? What'd you just say?" Yeah, you're a long time dead. You're not going to be on this world very long. And if you're not happy about where you're going today, maybe you need to go somewhere else. My practice habits improved immediately. Oh, I just got taken to the woodshed by the master himself, and I never complained again. Never did I ever complain about practice again. So that was one lesson, but that's not the one you're talking about. You're talking about the pregame speech that he made every single week. He would be standing over next to the door where we would go out through the Orioles dugout to run out on the field. And Freddie Miller, our defensive captain, would make this impassioned speech. We're going to run to the football. We're going to tackle. We're going to knock them. We're going to knock the ball loose. And he'd finish up and he'd turn. And Unitas is standing over there with his legs crossed, leaned up against the wall, holding his headgear. He'd say, "Okay, you got anything to say, John?" "Oh, sheep, let's go play." And he would turn and walk out. We would have followed him into hell. We would. That was his speech. So, I mean, he was just an unusual guy. Bart was an unusual guy. And they both, whatever they did, it worked.
Right. So maybe you could talk about some of the players that you went up against. Do any competitive defensive linemen come to mind when I say to you, Bill, who's some of the toughest people you went up against?
The most difficult guy I went up against was not a lineman. It was Dick Butkus.
Ooh.
The reason I say that is because you never knew what he was going to do. With defensive linemen, even the great ones, and the greatest was probably Merlin Olsen. Joe Green was really great. Deacon Jones was really great. All those guys gave me fits. And there were others. There was a guy named Houston Antwine for Boston Patriots. Gosh, he was so good. And that guy down in Miami, the nose tackle,
Manny Fernandez.
Manny was so strong, and he could get me up in the air like this. So all those guys were really great players.
Butkus, was he the toughest guy you went up against?
Butkus, yeah, because I've got a great Lombardi story about that too. So we're watching Butkus play on film, and he and I came up in the same rookie class. So we knew each other, and he's actually a nice guy off the field, or he was, God rest his soul. Believe it or not, but on the field, he was not a regular human being. Uh, Lombardi makes this bold statement about Dick Butkus, and he says, Butkus will never be a good linebacker. He's too stiff. He's going to have to be a down lineman. And we just kind of went on with the film. So we're playing the game against the Bears the same year. And Jimmy Taylor, who was by far the baddest running back in the league, he's coming off tackle like a rocket. And he led the league for several years in rushing. He and Jimmy Brown kind of divided it up. And I was not in the game. I was just a special teams player. So I'm watching down, and it looks, and the hole's opened up, and Jimmy's going to run for 20 yards. I mean, he's popping through the hole, and I mean, all of a sudden he disappeared. And the next thing we knew, he was unconscious on the field. His helmet had been knocked off, and Butkus had knocked him out, knocked his helmet off, took the ball from him, was running the other way. So we watched the film of that disaster the next Tuesday morning. Lombardi watches it, and he runs it back, and he runs it back again, and he runs it back. He says, I was wrong about that guy.
That is a great story. That is a great story. Not the name I thought you were going to say, but that's an incredible answer. So thank you for sharing that. You conclude your playing career, you get into coaching, and you have a great run as a coach. Was that always the plan, or did you fall into becoming a coach?
My dad really was a great coach, and I wish I had been a great coach. And I had great people that coached with me and played for me, both played on Saturdays and also played as scout teamers on our various teams. In football, it's my opinion. The reason I always say the same thing in answer to the great coach thing, great coaches have great records. They win most of their games, most anywhere they coach, in my opinion, in the sport of football. It may not be true in other sports. Probably not true in baseball. I know too much about baseball, but in football, you can get your guys and you get them ready, and you can beat most people most of the time if you've got that sort of magic. And you can, I mean, Shula, good grief. Nick Bonacani called me. Nick was a good friend, and after Shula got down there, he called me one day. He said, "This guy's nuts." I said, "Yeah, I told you that." He said, "We're running 6 gassers and it's 105 degrees. I said, "Yeah, but Nick, you're going to win. I promise you." Shula just didn't. I mean, Lombardi, you know what his playoff record was? 9-1. Nobody's close to him. You can't do that in the playoffs in the NFL. He lost one game. It was the first one to the Eagles in Philadelphia. He walked in the locker room and said, "That will never happen again." And it didn't. So that, to me, that's the real deal. So the coaching thing, I was anxious. I was drawn to the guys. I was drawn to the discipline. Mostly I was drawn to the diversity, inclusion. The fact that you cannot, if you want to be a great football team, if you even want to be a decent football team, you cannot have racists in the locker room. You can't do it, because it will destroy the unity. Because when the chips are down in the fourth quarter, there's 1:14 on the clock, and you're down by 4.
Right.
One timeout, and you got to have a touchdown to win. You're not thinking about another Super Bowl ring. You're not thinking about a bonus check. You're not thinking about winning the game. You're thinking about quitting, because it is so hard. It is tough. I just want to quit. If I'm playing against Merlin Olsen or Manny Fernandez, I don't have to leave the field to quit. All I got to do is turn my shoulders just a little bit and let him run back there and do what he does to quarterbacks. Nobody would know, right?
Right.
Wrong. There's a little flame that never flickers.
Right.
If you love your teammates, you will not let them down. And this little voice says, don't you dare. Don't you dare.
Right.
Don't you dare. You move your feet. You keep, I don't care how bad it hurts. You keep your head up. Don't you dare let your teammate, don't you let Johnny Unitas down that Bart Starr today. You can't do it. That's what great teams have with very ordinary physical specimens like me and some better specimens.
I got to tell you, you just fired me up. Whatever you did as a coach at work, because I'm ready to go.
You want to see it in action, all you got to do is watch the Super Bowl every year, because some team decides to do that, and I'm telling you, you can't beat them.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Bill, I've really enjoyed our discussion. This has exceeded my expectations. I was so excited when you got in touch with me. I want to end our conversation because, like you said during the conversation, you played with the encyclopedia of players. And what I do typically at the end of these discussions, I call it the binge burner. I put you on the hot seat. And I started listing names of players I wanted to ask you about and give me a sense or two of what you think. But before I knew it, I got like 12 people and I had to stop. So I'll ask you initially the one guy that I was very interested in learning about, and then I'll just pick a few names off of here, because any one of these guys, people are going to know the name, and I just don't know how to condense the list because you got so many great names. So the first one is Mad Dog Mike Curtis.
Mike was my roommate.
Right.
And we got along fine in the room. He had a history degree from Duke. I mean, he's very bright, but he loved his Mad Dog image, and he played to it. And he and I beat the stuffings out of each other every single day on the practice field. I knew that Sunday was going to be my easiest day when I played, as long as Mike and I were on the same team. He was a great player. God bless him. God rest his soul.
You know, it's interesting. He's, for people that don't remember or have never seen it, look him up. He's the guy that nailed the fan that came on the field. And then I found out later on, watching stuff about him, that he went into real estate. Like, how do you have him as your agent and saying no to him?
I don't think you do. I mean, he and I violently disagreed on Players Association things, but I mean, that was sort of par for the course in the NFL. You took your position and your teammates allowed you to. In my case, I was active with the union and anxious for the players to receive some rights. I wasn't so anxious for them to make hundreds of millions of dollars like they do now.
Right.
I would have been fine without that, but I'm glad they're doing well. But Mike was opposed to all of that, so we had those clashes, but not in the room and not in any way that made life unpleasant, except on the field.
How about Ray Nitschke?
Well, Ray's another guy. I owe him an apology to this day. He made my life miserable in the early days with the Green Bay Packers. And he did it strictly by doing his job, which was to be the best linebacker in football. And I couldn't block him. And I detested him for that, and I blamed him somehow. And that's stupid. That's irrational. And as the years passed, George Plimpton came along, and that's another long story. We'll have to do another session, but we wrote a book.
Right.
And I said some things about Ray that I shouldn't have. That seemed to have been a characteristic of mine in those days, and I'm so sorry that I did it. And I tried my best to make amends. And I decided one time that I was going to go fly to wherever Ray was and sit down with him and apologize. And I procrastinated, and I procrastinated some more. And then I picked up the paper and I read Ray Nitschke dead at age 61 or 62, heart attack. Great lesson there.
Yeah.
Young people who see this, if you think you owe somebody an apology, go do it now.
There you go. So I'll just cut it with this last name. I got more people on here. You've mentioned some of the names in our conversation, but I think what made Shula so great as a coach was he was able to play chess when other people were playing checkers, in the sense of he had Unitas, but he had Earl Morrall. He had Greasy, but he had Earl Morrall. And in 72, when Greasy goes down, Earl slots in, they go undefeated, Bob comes back, they complete the season. What was Earl like as a teammate?
It's beautiful. It was funny. I mean, he could lighten up the huddle. The way we came across Earl, we traded for him just before the last exhibition game in '68, and we went down to play Dallas in Dallas, and Unitas threw an 80-yard touchdown to Mackey on the first play of the game, and he comes off, and I happened to be standing with him, and he said, "Something's wrong with my arm. I can't even grip." And sure enough, he had torn this muscle in half. And that's why he didn't play a snap the whole season. We had this guy, Earl Morrall, who didn't know our snap count. He didn't know how to get in a huddle. He didn't know how to call plays. And the next week, we opened with the San Francisco 49ers in Baltimore. Earl sticks his head in the huddle. He says, "Okay, everything's under control." And Tom Maddie's over there. "Call the player, Earl, call it." "Okay, Maddie, let's see. And what's that split back formation? Just call it. Let me call the form." No. It'll be okay. Delay a game. Now they'll walk us back 5 yards, and everybody's just going crazy. Earl, he's just too calm. And all we did was win 15 games with him, and he was most valuable player in the National Football League. That's what Don Shula and Don McCafferty could do. McCafferty was the offensive coordinator. Don't forget that.
Okay. You mentioned Plimpton. Just plug it real quick. You did a book with him. Was that going to your last training camp? Was that what the book was based on?
Yeah, One More July. And Bart had just taken over the Packers, and he desperately needed a center. And I thought maybe I could play one more year, and I went up there and tried, but I couldn't do it.
And the other one is 10 Men You Need in the Huddle. I'm actually going to go get that book because it's real. Just the title itself is really interesting to me. So I'm going to go get that book. I'm unfortunately a member where my daughter is a voracious reader, Bill. She'll read 80 books a year. I'm a book of the decade club. So it'll, 10 years from now, we'll talk. I just finished your book. It's really good. So, but I'm definitely going to get 10 Men You Need in the Huddle. Bill, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed the discussion, the stories. Thank you.
Thank you.